Hi everyone. Welcome to this YouTube problem solving session for the I Think Biology course. This is an NPTEL course offered by the Azim Premji University, and today is the ninth tutorial. And I am Gidika Agarwal. I am a PhD scholar at the Center for Ecological Sciences in IISc Bangalore, and I will be taking this problem solving session today for you guys. So, mostly what I'll be doing today is summarizing what was covered in the lectures of um, week 9, and then I will be uh, conducting a small Q&A session so that you guys get an idea of what kind of questions might come in your exam, and you also get to revise what all is being taught during the week so that it stays fresh in your memory. Okay, so coming to the contents of this week. Sorry. So coming to the contents of this week. In this week, what was mostly discussed was ecological organization, how the communities are organized, how different where different players fit in these biological interactions, and how it's carried out. Then we discussed different types of ecological interactions, how different individuals interact with each other, whether they belong to the same species or the different species, what kind of interactions are these, do they benefit from these interactions, or do they stay unaffected, or are they harmed by these interactions. So what is going on there, that was discussed. And then we'll talk about the case studies discussed during this week, mostly related to figs, one about figs and fig wasps, and one where we discussed seed dispersal and figs. So coming to the different levels of organization in the ecosystem, or in or when it comes to the living systems. First of all, we do know that cells form the basic fundamental functional and structural unit of life. But here what we're talking about is organization in a community or in an ecosystem, or in the ecological sense of view, and not in the cellular or not in the atomic sense. So when you look at organization of on this scale, we're talking about individuals, and then how these individuals are organized in order to form a community and how they interact with each other. In this sense, when you talk about organization, you start with an individual. So there is an individual organism. It might be one bacterial cell, it might be one individual human being, one individual dog or a cat, or like in this image, you have an individual like this red deer, right? So you have an individual here, and then multiple individuals belonging to the same species come together and form a population. Okay, and then when different individuals belonging to different species, so when different species come together and they interact with each other, that forms a community. And when you're talking about different species, these can be plant species, these can be animal species. So different living species, when they come together and they interact with each other, these biotic interactions, they're all clumped together into a community, right? So here you can see there's a rabbit, there's this macaque, there's an owl, there's an elk, things like that. They form a community together along with these plants. Then, in a community, when you add the elements of biotic interactions and abiotic interactions, that is when you come to an ecosystem. So, ecosystem not just includes of all the biotic elements, but also the abiotic elements. Once that is done, then there are different kinds of ecosystems that come together to form a biome. So, when similar ecosystems are grouped together, that forms a biome, right? So, for example, there could be a forest biome in which all the forest ecosystems fall together, could be a desert biome, could be a river biome in which all the riverine systems come together, like can be grouped together into a biome. And then all these different biomes together, they form the biosphere, which is all of the um, life on the planet, for example, basically. So all of the life along with the abiotic factors, that forms the biosphere where any life is possible, right? So these are the different levels of organization that we come across when talking about ecology. Now, when looking a little more closely, when you come to individual level of organization, so what we're talking about here is, if somebody is studying an individual level, or if somebody is studying one singular individual, what they might be looking at could be the morphology of the individual. What does the individual look like? What is its behavior? If you're observing singular individuals in a species, what is their behavior? What amount of time? What is, for example, what are the different activities that they're doing? What is the time that they're allotting to these different activities? So that is when how you're studying the behavior of the individual. You could be looking at its physiology, So all of this comes into when you're looking at the individual level of organization. Then there can be things like animal personalities. For example, all of us human beings have our own personalities. In a similar manner, animals also have their own personalities, even though we've not yet studied about them much. But this field of research is also growing. People are looking at, or researchers are looking at animal personalities. Some of them are bold. They are open to taking risks. Some of them are much more shy. So things like that. So animal personalities. And then you could be looking at what is that particular individual eating, where is it living, what are its predators, things like that. So that is an individual level of study, right? When you're looking at a singular individual, or when you're looking at individuals, but like at when you're looking at them in a isolated from each other. So you're not looking at the interactions among individuals, but you're looking at them at their own individual level. Then you move on and you would be looking at population ecology when you're talking about different individuals but belonging to the same species. For example, here is a parakeet species and there are 12 individuals in this, sorry, 9 individuals in this image. There is a macaque species here, and then there is an elephant species here. So you're looking at populations where there are different individuals belonging to the same species, right? So here you could be studying the number of individuals present in an area. For example, you could be looking at the demographics of it. So you're looking at the number of a different number of individuals belonging to the same species. Just keep in mind belonging to the same species. So you're looking at the number of individuals present in an area. You could be looking at the population dynamics. So how is the population changing? How is the size of the population changing over time? That also comes under demographics. What is the age structure? How many what is the structure based on on the sex? How many males, how many females? Then how many young, how many adults, how many old individuals are there in the population? That all comes under population demographics. Then you could be looking at the interaction of the population, the interaction among the individuals in the population. Is there a social hierarchy, or are the individuals separated out? Do they maintain territories? How are they interacting with other individuals in the same population? And how are they interacting with the environment as well? Right? Then you move on, and then you might be looking at species ecology. So now, if you're looking at the distribution of species on the earth, so you're looking at different so when you're looking at different populations of the same species, so earlier you were looking at different number of individuals of the same species but forming one population. Now you're looking at different populations but all belonging, still belonging to the same species. When you're looking at all different populations, and that is something called species ecology. You're looking at the distribution of species on the earth, how many different populations are distributed across the planet. What is the breeding and the mating behavior of the species in general? When do they breed? When do they mate? How do they mate? What are the different types of behaviors in these systems? How, if you're talking about the house sparrow, how does it nest? Where does it nest? What does it eat? Feeding behavior. And you can study interactions of the species with other abiotic and biotic factors. Then you move on, and then you come to the next level of organization, which is actually the community level of organization, where you're looking at all the different species present in one particular ecosystem, present in one particular place, right? So when different species are present sympatrically, they're present in the same place. For example, here you can see a number of different species present in the same space. They're sharing the same space. So when a number of populations, which, now note, number of populations which belonging to different species, they live in the same place at the same time. So they are temporally and spatially present, overlapping all of these populations which are belonging to different species. So these populations belonging to different species, if they share this the place and if they are present at the same time, then they're called a community. And when you're looking at community ecology, that subject involves looking at interspecific interactions. So you're looking at how different species are interacting with each other. So now you're not looking at how different individuals are interacting with each other or how different populations are interacting with each other, the same species, but you're looking at how different species are interacting with each other. That is why the term interspecific interactions, right? So community ecology involves looking at interspecific interactions, how different species are interacting with each other. And you try and investigate what are the factors that are influencing the biodiversity. How is the community structured? Like, is there are there some species that play a more important role as compared to the other species? Are there some species which are central? Are there some species which are more dominant? For example, are they more aggressive species and others are stay away from them? Things like that. What is the role in the food chain, for example, of that particular species? Is that species an apex predator or is it a producer? What is happening? How are the different species distributed? What are the spaces they're occupying, and what is the abundance of these different species? So that all comes under community ecology. Okay. Moving on to ecosystems. So when you're studying ecosystems, there are many different types of ecosystems, and ecosystem involves not just the community, not just the biotic factors, but when you're looking at the interaction of the biotic with the abiotic factors, that is when you're talking about the ecosystem of the area, right? So there are different types of ecosystems. There is a list of some here. There are tropical rainforests. There are tropical grasslands, which are also called savannas. For example, you might be aware of the African savannas. There are a lot of these grasslands present in India as well. Um, there are some of them present in the Western Ghats. There are a lot of them present in Maharashtra and Gujarat. So there are a lot of these savanna areas in India as well. Then there are the desert grasslands. For example, we have the Thar in India. Then there is the temperate forests. There are temperate grasslands, and there is tundra, which is again like a desert but in colder temperatures. And then you move on to the coniferous forests, which have these pine trees or coniferous trees. Then there is the Mediterranean, which is the like the shrublands, and then there are the mountains. So, when you are integratedly studying the living, that is the biotic, and the non living, which is the abiotic components of the ecosystem, and how are they interacting with each other in this framework, that is when that is called an ecosystem ecology, right? And so, you're examining how an ecosystem functions and how the various processes like the food webs, nutrient cycling, how that is happening and how they are interacting with one another. So, that is all about ecosystem. And so, and when you're looking at different ecosystems and comparing them, that is when your study goes up to the biome level. Okay. Now, when we've talked about food chains enough, and you might already be aware of what are food chains because this is something that is taught to us in our high school at a pretty early level, right? So, in a food chain, there is a transfer of energy in the form of food from producers. For example, producers, you might already be aware, are autotrophs, are organisms that can make their own food. For example, plants or algae. They utilize sunlight and they harvest the sunlight and produce carbohydrates from that sunlight by combining carbon dioxide and water, right? And in the presence of light, they make carbohydrates. So, when there is a transfer of energy in the form of food from producers to herbivores to carnivores and so on, that is what is a food chain, right? And for example, there is an example food chain here. So you start with the producer. There are a lot of these green plants. They are producing their own food by photosynthesizing. Photosynthesis, you might be aware, again, as I already said, taking up carbon dioxide and water and converting that into carbohydrates in the presence of light. That is photosynthesis. And green plants are capable of doing that. So they are called producers or autotrophs. And then you have a first level of consumer, which is called a primary consumer. In this example, it's a grasshopper. A grasshopper might be feeding on all this grass and all these leaves. Then there is a secondary consumer. In this case, it's a frog, which is feeding on these grasshoppers. And so energy is transferring. And then there is a tertiary consumer. Here is a snake. A snake is feeding on different frogs. And then there is a final consumer here, which is a hawk, in which can be called an apex predator in this particular food chain. And this hawk might be feeding on these snakes. And then eventually, there is detritivores like fungus and bacteria which feed on the dead bodies that are present in the ecosystem, right? For example, eventually when any of these dies, then these detritivores, they act on their dead remains and they convert that energy and release it back into the environment, right? So that is food chain. Now you come to the different trophic levels. So a food chain has these different trophic levels, as we already discussed. You start with producers, then you come to primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and finally um, all of these lead to a decomposer as well in the end. So each of the several hierarchical levels in an ecosystem or in a food chain, that's called trophic levels, right? Each of the several hierarchical levels that are present in an ecosystem. Organisms that belong to the same trophic level, they have a similar function in the food chain and the same nutritional relationship to the producer. Okay, so all the organisms that belong to the same trophic level, they have a more or less a similar function in the food chain, and they also are related to the producer in the same manner. For example, if there is a grasshopper, if there's a bird, if there is a caterpillar, all of these are feeding on the plants, then all of them are related to the producers in the same manner, right? So that is how they have a similar nutritional relationship. They're all primary consumers. And organisms that occupy can occupy more than one trophic levels. So it is not that if a grasshopper is feeding on grass, that is all it does and it cannot consume anything else, right? It can consume some smaller insects as well. So so an organism, if it is consuming some other smaller insects, then it is occupying a different trophic level. Then it might become a secondary consumer, right? So organisms can occupy more than one trophic levels. They're not limited to just one singular trophic level. Okay. So some of the basic trophic levels we have, for example, we have the producers, which is mostly plants and algae, which can photosynthesize. Then we have primary consumers, or the herbivores. For example, grasshoppers, cows, caterpillars, birds, butterflies, anything of the sort. Then you move on to secondary consumers. For example, again, this could be birds which are feeding on these grasshoppers and these butterflies. Could be frogs, could be rodents, could be squirrels, anything of that sort. And then there are tertiary consumers which feed on these birds, or it could be snakes, like this, and as we said, decomposes as some fungi and bacteria that in the end process all of the dead decaying matter that's present in the ecosystem, right? Now let's see what are autotrophs or producers. I've already discussed this a little bit in brief, but let's take a deeper look into this. So autotrophs or producers, they are organisms that can produce their own food, and they do not depend on other organisms for their energy requirements, right? So you would be well aware of this by now, because this is something that is that falls in very basic life science and is taught from a very young age to all of us. So autotrophs or producers are organisms that can make their own food. They can synthesize their own food, mostly by harvesting the sunlight, harvesting light energy, and combining carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates. And they do not depend on other organisms for their energy requirements, right? Now you can have either photoautotrophs, which I've been talking about so far, the organisms that use light energy to manufacture food. They can also be chemoautotrophs, in which the organisms, they actually manufacture their food by using chemical energy and not light energy, right? For photoautotrophs, sun is the source of energy. For chemoautotrophs, chemical reactions are the source of energy and not really sun. And examples of photoautotrophs include plants mostly, which contain chlorophyll, and some algae as well. And for chemoautotrophs, the examples are, for example, there is hydrogen vibris, which lives in the deep sea thermal vents. So it would be an archaea, which actually lives in the deep sea hydrothermal wells. And since their sunlight does not reach there, so it manufactures its own food based on with the help of chemical reactions. This was all about autotrophs. Coming to heterotrophs or consumers, these are organisms that cannot produce their own food, and they actually therefore depend on other organisms for their energy requirements. And decomposers or detritivores, they are organisms that feed on dead and decaying matter which is present in the ecosystem, and they return the nutrients back to the soil, includes fungi, microorganisms, and earthworms. Okay, I hope this is clear. So far, we were discussing only all of these basic things about food chains and the different trophic levels, and how an organism can actually fit into the different levels is not limited to one particular trophic level. Now, let's look at the different types of food chains. So, there are different types of food chains, and here I'm talking about four different types of food chains: grazing food chains, detritus food chains, predator food chains, and parasitic food chains. Most of these are very clearly indicative by the term itself. Grazing food chains, of course, starts with a producer, which is like a plant. In a predator food chain, what you're mostly talking about is when a carnivore is feeding on some other organisms. Detritus, in which you're talking about dead and decaying matter, and parasitic food chain, which you're talking about parasites. So in the grazing food chain, as I said, it starts from a plant base or an autotroph, and it's mostly longer in length because the autotroph is producing a lot of biomass, which is passed on. We'll come to it later how the length of the food chain is determined. So it's mostly longer in length. Then detritus food chain, it starts from dead and decaying matter. It's mostly shorter in length. Then you come to predator food chain. So the successive trophic levels, they comprise of predators. So the secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, all of these are predators. So the successive trophic levels comprise of predators, organisms that feed on the current trophic level. So if you're at the producer level, then your primary one is also a predator. If you're talking about the primary consumer, then secondary consumer is a predator. So all the successive trophic levels, they comprise of predators depending on what our current trophic level is. A size of the organisms increases, but the number of organisms in successive trophic levels decrease. So if you are talking about like insects in the primary consumer level, in the secondary level you might be talking about birds, so they are bigger than these insects. And then in the tertiary level you might be talking about bigger birds like eagles or hawks, which feed on these smaller birds. And so the number of organisms, so you have a lot of insects, then you have a few birds, and then you have only one or two tertiary consumers, right? So the number of organisms in successive trophic levels keeps decreasing, but the size of the organism keeps increasing, right? Compared to this, if you look at a parasitic food chain, so the successive trophic levels, they comprise of parasites and not of predators. So organisms that parasitize on the current trophic level. Size of the organism keeps decreasing in parasitic food chains, and the number of organism keeps increasing. So if you're talking about, say for example, you have a cattle on which you have these ticks or mites, and then on these ticks or mites you might have parasitoids themselves. Parasitoids are organisms that are actually parasitizing on a parasite itself, right? So these are parasitoids. So when you're moving on to successive trophic levels, the organisms are if they occupy the successive trophic levels, actually parasitize on the current trophic level. Size of the organism keeps decreasing, but the number of organisms in the successive levels keeps increasing. So I hope this is clear. Um, so this is an example of grazing food chain. Starts with grass, primary producer, then primary consumer, then frog, snake, apex predator, and a decomposer. Detritus food chain, in which there are dead leaves. These might be eaten by a woodlouse, which might be eaten by a blackbird. So this woodlouse is actually feeding on these dead leaves. So that is why it's a detritus food chain, because the starting point is actually dead and decaying matter. And it's not that long because there is not that much nutrition in these dead leaves to sustain a longer food chain. But here, when grass is the primary producer, it is producing so much biomass or so much food reserve that this food chain can actually go longer. Then a parasitic food chain, for example, there is a plant that has a lot of fruit. Herbivores are, or fruit eating birds are eating this fruit. But now comes in the parasites. There are parasite like lice or bugs that lives on these birds or these herbivores. And then there are hyperparasites or parasitoids, which are themselves parasitizing these lice and bugs. Again, this is not a very long food chain, but yeah, this is what a parasitic food chain is like. And the size of the organism keeps decreasing as you go for further in the food chain, but the number of organisms keeps increasing, right? Now, let's talk about food webs. So, you all might already be aware that food chains are not very realistic. So, that is not how energy is actually transferred in the environment, because a lot of these food chains are actually interlinked. Then there's not all of them have a linear relationship. It's not that okay, fine, there is grass and now only deer will feed on the grass and then only wolf will feed on the deer. That is not how food chains occur. Most of these are actually interlinked with each other. And when you talk about interlinkings between different food chains, that is when you reach a food web, as you can see in this image on the right. So you have a food chain which is actually linear, and you have a food web in which there are a lot of interlinks between different organisms. And an intricate structure is formed when multiple food chains are linked together. And food chains in reality are never isolated, and millions of them are interconnected. In this image you can see, for example, there are plants are being fed upon by grasshoppers. Even birds can directly feed upon plant products, or even the squirrel can be feeding on the plant products. Then bird might be feeding on the grasshopper, and squirrels can also be feeding on the grasshopper. Then these birds can be eaten by foxes, can be eaten by bigger birds, and same can be happening to the squirrels. And again, here also you have a marine food web in which all the different organisms are interlinked with each other, right? Now, let's talk about energy flow in an ecosystem, right? Yeah. So let's talk about how energy flows in an ecosystem. So you may or may not be aware, but when we go forward in a food web or in a food chain, when you move from one trophic level to next, only 10% of the energy gets transferred to the next trophic level. Okay, so and the rest of it is actually lost. So from the sun, if you have some, if the sun is giving out a certain amount of energy, only some of it will be captured by the plants and the other of it is lost as heat, right? And from the plant, when the energy is being transferred on, as I said, only 10% of this energy will move on and the rest of it will be lost in some ways. In this we have marked it as heat, and so on and so forth. So energy, one thing is that energy only flows in a unidirectional manner from producers to consumers. So it is not going to happen that energy from the bird is going to go back to the plant. That does not happen. The plant is not consuming the bird, right? So energy flows in a unidirectional manner from the lower trophic levels to the higher trophic levels. And from the law of thermodynamics, energy can neither be created nor be destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to another. And the second law of thermodynamics states that this transformation of energy is not 100% efficient. And during energy transfer, there is a degradation of energy from a concentrated form, which can be a mechanical energy, chemical energy, potential energy, electrical energy, anything, and it gets a little dispersed, for example, in the form of heat, right? So there are these two laws of thermodynamics in physics which stay intact even when you're talking about these food chains, when you're talking about these biological living systems, right? So, first is that energy can neither be created nor be destroyed. It can only be transformed from one form to another. And the second is the transformation of energy is never 100% efficient. So if you have an X amount of energy in one place and when it's being transferred to something else, then only a certain proportion of X will get transferred and not the entire amount of energy will get transferred, right? So these are the two laws of thermodynamics. And when you're moving along in a food chain, only 10% of the energy moves forward. So if at one trophic level you have, for example, in the first trophic level, you have full energy, say 100. So we move on to the next one. You'll only get a 10% of that, which is 10. Ra. So the 10% rule of energy flow, right? So only about 10% of energy stored as biomass in a trophic level is passed on to the next level. So only 10% of the energy stored as biomass in a trophic level is passed on from one level to the next, right? This is known as the 10% rule of energy flow, and it limits the number of trophic levels you have in an ecosystem, or it limits the number of how long your food chain can become. That is limited by this 10% rule of energy flow. So now you can take a note of this, that um, this 10% rule of energy flow is what limits the number of levels you have in a food chain, right? And only 10% of energy stored as biomass is transferred to the next level. So if you're talking about 1,000 joules of light energy comes from the sun um, to this grass, then 990 of this joules will be lost to the environment and only 10 joules will be transferred as food to the deer, right? From the deer, now since only 10% goes, so you say 10, what is 10% of 10? 10% of 10 is 1, right? So only 1 will go forward to the next level, which is in this case, say an apex predator like a lion. And then from the lion, only 0.1% will go forward, right? So that much, that is how energy gets transferred in a food chain. Okay, one second, let me erase this. Yeah, energy loss can happen. Why is energy getting lost? So there are 3 points here. Energy loss can either happen because of incomplete digestion, because the food is not digested properly, because of respiration, because we are continuously, or every organism is continuously respiring and some amount of energy is being lost in the process of respiration, and we are also always radiating some heat out of us, so loss of energy in the form of heat from our bodies to the atmosphere. So these are the three places how energy can be lost from a particular trophic level. Coming to ecological pyramids. So, ecological pyramids are actually graphical representations of the number of organisms, the biomass, and the energy of organisms at each particular trophic level. So, if you're talking about ecological pyramids, they're actually the graphical representations of what is the number of organisms, what is the biomass, and what is the energy of organisms at each different trophic levels. And trophic levels, they represent the functional role of the species and not a particular species. As I said, one species can occupy more than one trophic levels in the ecosystem. So when you're talking about trophic levels, that is just a functional role of the species and not that particular species in the ecosystem, right? So if you're talking about numbers, so in a normal grazing food chain, producers are a lot more in number than primary, and primary consumers are a little less, secondary consumers are lesser, and tertiary consumers are even they are even further smaller in number, right? So as you keep moving up the food chain, the number for a graphical for the number of organisms, they keep decreasing as you keep moving up the food chain. An exception to this is the parasitic food chain, right? Then if you're talking about biomass, that is also like an erect pyramid that will also be straight. Again, the biomass will be highest in the producers, and then as you keep moving from primary to secondary to tertiary, the biomass will keep decreasing. And the same is the case with energy of organisms as well. At each trophic level, energy of organisms also follows an upright pyramid. Energy is highest here, and as you keep moving forward, the energy keeps decreasing because you are well aware of the 10% rule now, right? Right. Coming to trophic cascades. So, what are trophic cascades? So, actually, we were talking about all of these trophic levels, food chains, everything. So, this all you might already be aware of. Something new for you now is these trophic cascades. So, trophic cascade is an ecological phenomena which is triggered by actually either if you add or if you remove a top predator. So you have all these trophic levels. So you have these apex predators, right? So what happens in an ecosystem when you either remove this apex predator from the ecosystem or you either add an apex predator to the ecosystem? Then what happens is what is called a trophic cascade, because what happens then actually impacts all the lower trophic levels. And how that is happening, that is why it's called a cascading effect, because it's affecting the entire community now of the ecosystem, right? That's why it's a cascade. It involves reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predators and prey. So if you add a top predator, then next one will actually decrease, and the skip one will increase. But if you remove the predator, then the population of this level will boost, and the population of the skip level will go down because this level is actually consuming that level, right? So that is how it involves reciprocal changes in the relative populations of predator and prey. It oftentimes results in dramatic changes in the ecosystem and in the nutrient cycling and indirect mutualism between non adjacent levels of the food chain. So it brings forth the indirect mutualism between the non adjacent levels or the skip levels in the food chain. So if you're talking about, say, you have a food chain with a producer, then a primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer. If you remove this tertiary consumer, then the number of secondary consumers will go up, the number of primary consumers will go down, and the number of producers will also go up. Now, if you only had these three levels of producer, primary, and secondary, and now you add the tertiary consumer, then the number of secondary consumers will go down, number of primary consumers will up, and the producers will also go down. So that is how the skip levels are actually positively related to each other, and and that is why there is a reciprocal change in the relative populations of predator and prey, right? Now, coming to a little bit of a case study to give you a better example of how trophic cascades happen. So, this is a case study about sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp. So, how their food chain looks like is kelp is the producer. So, these are actually sea grasses. So, these are grasses of the sea or the ocean. So, kelp is the producer level. Then there are these sea urchins which feed on kelps, and then there are sea otters which feed on these sea urchins, right? So, what happened was during the 1800s, the sea otters were hunted near to their extinction along the Pacific coast of North America, right? So, along the Pacific coast of North America, a lot of hunting of sea otters happened and they were hunted near to their extinction in the 1800s. And this, as I said, because now if you remove this level, if you remove the sea otters, what will happen is these sea urchins will, the population will explode. So there was this led to an explosion in the population of sea urchins because there were now fewer otters to feed on them. Then what happened is consequently the kelp forests got destroyed because of heavy predation pressure by the increasing sea urchin populations. So what you see here is this is how the kelp forests looked like when there were sea otters and the sea urchin populations were in control. But when these sea otters got hunted near to their extinction, all of these forests, they just became barren, urchin barrens, because they were just covered by these sea urchins and there were no kelp anymore, right? So this is how, without us realizing, we brought along this trophic cascade, which had a lot of these. which actually impacts multiple different trophic levels. That is why it's called a cascade, right? Moving on to another case study of a trophic cascade. This case study comes from the Barra, Colorado island. So when you look at this area south of California, so there is this Panama which joins, right? In Panama, there was this hilltop called the Barro, Colorado, and there was sudden increase in sea level, and that is when this hill got isolated from the adjacent mainland. So earlier, this Barro, Colorado hill was actually connected to the mainland, but then what happened, because of the increase in the sea levels, it actually became an island. It got separated from the mainland, and so this island had a lot of this area. Had rainforests, and it had a lot of diversity. So it had a lot of bird species, and it had bigger apex predators like pumas and jaguars, and it has these mesopredators also. But because of the presence of these apex predators, these mesopredators were in check. These ocelots, and then these smaller macaques, and all of these snakes, all these populations were in check because of these bigger predators. But what happened when Barra, Colorado became an island is that because it became a small island, and because pumas and jaguars have larger territories, they could not sustain these large apex predators. And so these apex predators, they they were became absent. They were extinct in the island. So they were not found in the island anymore. And they were found in the mainland, but they were not found in the island because the island was small and could not sustain the populations of these apex predators. And now, as you might already have guessed, because the apex predators were absent, the populations of these ocelots, they shot up. And that is what is called a mesopredator release. As I've mentioned in this slide, mesopredator release. When top predators are absent, a sudden boost is observed in the mesopredator populations. So, as you can see in this image, these ocelots are actually small cats. They're also felines, but they're smaller in size than these jaguars and pumas. And because when these bigger predators are present, these small ones stay in check. The populations stay in check, and they do not get enough food. Even if they're not being preyed upon by these bigger ones, they actually stay away from their area, and the populations also stay in check. But now, because these apex predators are absent, the top predators are absent, then there was a sudden boost in the mesopredator populations because there is decreased competition and there is less harassment from the top felines, right? Now, Barra, Colorado Island, it's separated from the mainland, and the populations of apex predator, as I said, they could not be sustained and they got eliminated. And this led to an increase in the number of ocelots and other mesopredators in the area. And then what happened is there were a lot of these bird species, and a lot of them were ground nesting because there were not many predators to their ground nests. So there were a lot of these ground nesting birds. But what happened once Barra, Colorado became an island is that scientists started observing that a lot of these plant species, these ground nesting birds, started getting extinct. And that was because the number of mesopredators shot up, and now they were consuming a lot more of these. They were the nest predation rates for these ground nesting birds became very high, and since a lot of nest predation was happening, these birds eventually got extinct from these islands. Okay, so that is how this is a trophic cascade because the apex predators got lost, the mesopredators increased, and because mesopredators increased, the bird populations were affected and they were impacted, and the nest predation rates went quite high. They shot up in this area. All right. So these were two case studies to discuss trophic cascades. Now we come to the next topic, which is interactions. Now we have looked at ecological. So far, we've looked at ecological organization, how the communities are organized, and then we looked at the food chains and what are the different trophic levels and what are trophic cascades. Now let's look at what are interactions. So, what interactions are we talking about? So, interactions are how organisms in a community affect each other. So if you're living together in an area, so for example, take an example of your family. When you're living together as a family, individuals in the family will definitely impact each other in a certain way, right? Similarly, when you're living together, when organisms are living together in a community, different organisms will have an impact on each other, and how they are affecting each other is what is interaction, right? So, interactions can be classified based on who you are interacting with. If you're interacting with your conspecifics or individuals belonging to the same species, then that is called an intraspecific interaction. If you're interacting with Heterospecifics means individuals belonging to a different species, then that's called an interspecific interaction. Another thing which is used to classify interaction is what kind of interaction is it. If it's if it's it can either be a harmonious interaction in which there is some sort of a benefit being exchanged between the two species, or it could be an inharmonious interaction in which either one of the two species is being actually harmed, right? So this is how you can classify different interactions based on who you're interacting with and what you're getting out of that interaction, right? So moving on to different forms of interactions. Okay. So there are these different forms of interactions. There is mutualism, there is competition, there is predation, parasitism, commensalism, amensalism. So now let's see how the two participants are being impacted by these different interactions. So when you're talking about mutualism, both the participants, when they are being benefited by the interaction that they share, then that's called a mutualism. If there are two participants and both of them after the interaction are being benefited, then that's called a mutualism. Okay. If both of them are being harmed, then that's a competition. Both of them are facing some costs, then that interaction will be labeled as a competition. If one of them is being benefited and the other is being harmed, then that is a predation in which there is a predator which is consuming a prey. The prey is harmed and the predator is benefited. Could be parasitism, in which the parasite is benefited and the host is harmed. It could be a commensalism if one of the participants is being benefited and the other is unaffected. So there's an interaction between two individuals. One of them is getting benefited and the other one is completely unaffected by the interaction. Then that is called a commensalism. And the opposite of commensalism is an amensalism, in which one of them is unaffected but the other one is actually getting harmed. Okay, so these are the different forms of interactions that we find in the environment in the living world, right? So we'll talk about these interactions in further detail. We'll come to them one by one. Now, what is proto cooperation? So there is another term called proto cooperation. In this, what is happening is both the parties are being benefited, but it is not necessary for their survival. So another term you could use for proto cooperation is actually facultative mutualism. In mutualism, as we discussed, both the parties are benefited by the interaction. Again, in proto cooperation also, we are saying this solely that both the parties of the interaction are being benefited, but when you talk about this not being necessary for the survival, then it becomes a facultative mutualism. So mutualism can either be facultative or obligate. It's facultative if the two species, the two organisms can live without each other and they don't really require each other for their survival. Like it's not necessary for their survival. They can live without each other, but if they end up interacting, it's beneficial for both the parties. And an obligate mutualism is when both of them require each other for their survival and they cannot survive without each other, then that is a obligate mutualism. So here we are terming facultative mutualism as proto cooperation. Some examples are like here you can see there's a bird and there's a crocodile. What is happening in this image is that the bird is actually cleaning the crocodile's teeth. So the crocodile might have certain ectoparasites in its teeth, which might require cleaning, and the bird feeds on these ectoparasites, ridding the crocodile of its pain while cleaning the crocodile's teeth. In return, the crocodile does not feed on the bird. It actually sits with its mouth open to receive these cleaning services from the bird. So it is a mutualism, both of them, or it is a proto cooperation, both of them are being benefited, but it's not a case that they cannot survive without this interaction. They can very well survive without the interaction as well, but both of them are benefiting from the interaction. Then there's another one in which you see this shell. Here you see, so in this image, what we see is that there is a sea anemone and a hermit crab. So this shell is of a hermit crab, and the sea anemone attaches itself to the hermit crab, and it gains mobility. It moves as the crab moves, and the crab in return is getting the benefits of protection because of the sea anemone, right? So this is again a proto cooperation. Then there is this in which the hippo is getting its teeth cleaned by these cleaner fish, and there is this ant aphid interaction in which the ant is providing defense to these aphids, and the aphids in return provide this sugary sap to these ants. So what happens is these aphids, they actually are sucking out the sap of the plants, but they're sucking this sap not for its sugar, not for its carbohydrates, but for its nitrogen content, for its nutrients. So because of that, they drink a lot of the sap from the plant. So they actually puncture the plant, and from the xylem they take a lot of this liquid, and they're trying to get the nitrogen from these from the plant sap. But because nitrogen is in very limited numbers, they end up consuming a lot of this sap. What they do is they keep consuming and excreting this sap, and with this excreta is rich in carbohydrates, because this plant sap is rich in carbohydrates. It's not being used by aphids. So ants and other organisms, they actually feed. So ants that feed on this sap which is being produced by aphids, they actually provide protection to these aphids, and they very aggressively defend these aphids against any of their predators. So the aphids are getting defensive. They're getting defense services. They're being protected against predators, and these ant is getting food in return from these aphids, right? Moving on to mutualisms, or in this case, obligate mutualisms. So it's a positive interaction between the two participants, and it's obligatory for their survival. As I've already mentioned, they both require both the parties require this. They cannot live without this interaction. So here we have uh, pulses, and uh, here we have an example of pulses, or like legumes, and they have rhizobia. These rhizobia, as you know, these are nitrogen fixing. They contain nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they fix nitrogen and provide nutrition to the plant, and the plant provides them food in return. There are these coral reefs. They you know that corals are actually and they have a mutualism with algae. So coral is actually the animal part of these reefs, and the zooxanthellae is the plant part which provides the nutrition. So the animal part provides the shelter to the zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae actually provide nutrition to the rest of the structure. Right. Now another example is that termites, and there are these microbes that live inside termites which actually digest, which we discussed in the previous tutorials. So these microbes within the termite, they actually digest these cellulose in the wood, which the termite itself would not be able to digest, and the termite in return is providing a place to stay to these microbes, right? So these are different types of mutualisms in which they are actually obligatory for the survival of both the parties. Now, coming to commensalism, as we discussed, commensalism is an interaction in which one of the parties is benefited while the other stays unaffected. So, a very famous example are cattle egrets and cattle. So, when cattle actually move across grasslands or when they're grazing, they're disturbing a lot of the insects that are actually just sitting in these grasslands. And these insects then get disturbed and they fly out of these grasslands, and then they are captured by these cattle egrets. These cattle egrets are just following the cattle along when they go on their feeding. Routes, and when they're feeding on the grass and disturbing all the insects sitting there, the cattle egrets are actually feeding on these insects that get disturbed by the cattle, right? And then there are these fish that actually follow these bigger predators like the sharks, and when the sharks feed on something, there is a lot of this a lot of the times there are little bits and pieces of food that actually escapes the sharks mouth, and these small bits and pieces are consumed by these follower fishes. So the shark is not being affected by this by this interaction with these follower fishes, but these follower fishes are actually benefiting by feeding on the morsels that are that escape the shark's mouth, right? Coming on to competition. Competition, as discussed, is an interaction in which both the individuals, they face a cost. So when multiple individuals, they share a particular resource, so they have coinciding niches in some sense, which might be completely or partially overlapping. So if both the individuals are sharing the same resource, they want to use the same resource, then they have a competition. They face a competition because none of the resources are like a lot. Like all the resources in the nature are limited, right? We don't have like unlimited resources in nature, and because all resources are limited, individuals face competition for when they're consuming for these resources. For example, in this image you see this wildebeests in the grassland, and there are so many of them, and all of them are feeding on grass. So this is like an intraspecific competition between these different wildebeests when they're feeding on grasses, and all of them are facing competition. So all of them need to optimize their own feeding so that they get their full and do not stay starved, because there are so many other individuals around them which are also feeding on these grasses. Then the other example that I show here, you see a tree cavity or a nesting hole. So this cavity is actually there is a lot of competition for these tree cavities because a lot of a lot of bird species nest in these tree cavities, and they have overlapping breeding seasons. So you have parakeets, you have mynas, you have owls, you have squirrels, you have monitor lizards. All these different species use tree cavities, right, for their breeding. So there, if you have tree cavities, or if you have trees around in your neighborhood and you observe some cavities, you should carefully observe them during these bird breeding seasons, because you'll definitely see birds competing for these cavities. Okay, there are different types of competition. One competition is called an interference or a contest competition, and as the term suggests, if it's a contest competition, then they're actually preventing the approach to the resource. It's a direct conflict, and the individuals prevent the approach to the resource even if they're not using it themselves, but they are trying to prevent the competitor from approaching the resource. And the other one is an exploitative or a scramble competition. It's an indirect kind of competition in which what is happening is both of them are using the same resource, but if one individual is able to use that resource faster than the other one, then the other one will face a cost. So both of them have to use the resource faster. So examples in the interference or contest competition, it's territorial display when you're maintaining a territory. So even if you're not using the territory or every all the resources in your territory at the moment, you're still maintaining a big territory, and you're fending off all your competitors from that area by directly conflicting with them by putting up territorial displays, which might be scenting. In case of a lot of mammals, they leave scent marks in their territory so that other competitors don't enter their territory. In case of birds, they actually sing and do territorial displays at the edge of their territories when they perch high on top of the trees and they're singing at the edge, so they're telling that this is my territory, nobody else can enter this area. And for an exploitative or a scramble competition, if some of organisms are grazing faster than others, then that's a way of a scramble competition, right? Moving on to how to avoid competition. How so we know, we are aware that there are a lot of these organisms that live together, that coincide, like they they live in the same areas, and they might be feeding on the same things, and they still, all of them are co-occurring, they're not getting excluded from that area, right? So how are they avoiding competition? So to avoid competition, one important thing that happens in all of these organisms is something called niche partitioning, right? They can so for example, in these images you see there is a tiger. So if you take an example of Western Ghats, you have organisms like tigers, then you have dholes or wild dogs, as you can see in the second image, and then you have jaguars, or sorry, leopards, as you see in the third image, right? So all of these, they are carnivores, so they are potentially predators. All of them could be feeding on things like deer or these smaller prey. So all of these organisms, right? So they coincide, or they like co-occur, and they feed on similar prey. But how are they avoiding competition? So for avoiding competition, what they can do is they can partition their niches. They can either do it by behaviorally doing different things, by temporally partitioning. So some of them might be feeding during the day, some of them might be feeding during the night, some of them might be crepuscular. So they can temporally partition themselves, they can spatially distribute themselves. So if this is the zone that is occupied by the tiger, the dholes can stay in that zone, the leopards can stay in the other zone. So they can spatially spread out and not completely overlap, so that they're not using the same resources. Or they can diet partition, they can be feeding on different diets, different things. So for example, in this example, you have both leopards and dholes. They're both predators, they're potential competitors, as I already said. But leopards and tigers are ambush predators. So this is an example of behavioral partitioning. Leopards and tigers are ambush predators. They stay hidden. And for example, leopards stay hidden in trees. The tigers stay hidden in in tall grasses. They stay hidden. And when they see a prey close by, that is when they suddenly strike the prey, right? Whereas in the case of dholes, they actually are pack predators. They stay in a pack and they chase their prey for long distances. So they are not ambush predators. So this is a kind of behavioral partitioning. Another sort of partitioning is like a partitioning in diet. Tigers, since they're bigger in size, they also feed on bigger prey like sambar deer. Whereas leopards and dholes, since they are smaller in size, they are okay with feeding on smaller prey. For example, barking deer or mouse deer or wild pigs and things like that. Okay. I hope this is clear how different species or different potential competitors coexist in the ecosystem. Now, coming to the competitive exclusion principle, that when does this niche partitioning not help? Since we talked about niche partitioning and how they can use slightly different niches, I maybe should have mentioned this before, but Gauss, he stated in his competitive exclusion principle that two species cannot occupy the same niche in a habitat. Or in other words, two species cannot exist or cannot coexist indefinitely if they are competing for the exact same resources. So if there are two species and they both are utilizing the exact same resource, then both of them will not coexist indefinitely. One of them will get excluded, one of them will become extinct, and the other one will take over. That is why it's called a competitive exclusion principle. It was put forth by Gauss. And to test this, what happened was there is this back paramecium. So they took this paramecium and they took two species, paramecium aurelia and paramecium caudatum. So if you see in these first two graphs, if they are both cultured alone, if these species are cultured alone separately in a plate of media, then they both survive very well. But if both the species are grown together in the same culture plate with the same amount of resource, then you see that Paramecium aurelia is actually the one that survives, and Paramecium caudatum gets excluded from that plate. So Paramecium caudatum disappears from that plate, and aurelia survives much better, right? So this is how competitive exclusion principle works. Okay. Coming to another type of an interaction, this is allelopathy. So, uh, sorry. So coming to this next extraction called allelopathy. What is allelopathy? Allelopathy is actually a biological phenomena by which one organism is producing biochemicals, and these can influence the growth, the survival, reproduction of other organisms. So it's a phenomena in which one organism can be producing biochemicals, and these will influence the growth and survival of other organisms. It's very common in plants. So if you have these plants, then a lot of them actually release water soluble compounds which impact the growth of adjacent or neighboring plants, and they mostly stunt the growth of neighboring plants so as to allow this plant to grow and spread itself, right? So that is allelopathy, in which an organism is actually producing biochemicals which influence the growth of neighboring organisms. Okay, coming to a competition type which is called an apparent competition. So we talked about competition, we talked about indirect or scramble competition, and we talked about direct or contest competition. Now let's talk about apparent competition. What happens here is it is mostly an interaction between two prey species which share a common predator. Okay, so if there are two prey species, for example, say there are two different species of butterflies and they share a common bird predator, then the interaction between these two common butterfly species A and B is called an apparent competition. Okay, what happens here is if you have, say, species A and um, and species B, both of them are being fed upon by the same predator. Say the population of species A goes up. Okay, the population of species A rises. Now, because there is more species A, so predator is getting more food, and the population of predator will also go high. Now, because the population of predator goes up, then the population of species, so the predation pressure on species 2 also increases now. Even though the species 2 ka population has not increased, the number of species 2 individuals has not increased, but the predator pressure on species 2 has increased because there are more predators in the environment. And this brings down the population of species 2. So this is an apparent competition, even though both the species did not even directly interact with each other. But because the number of species A increased, number of predator increased, and because the number of predator increased, the number of species B decreased because the predator pressure on species B increased. Okay, I hope this is clear. I'll explain it one last time. So, if in a ecosystem or if in a community there are two prey species and they share a common predator. So, say these species are species A and species B. So, if the number of species A goes up, it means that the food resource for the predator has increased. Now, since the food for the predator has increased, the number of predator will also increase. Now, if the number of predator increase, then the predator pressure is high, and the predator pressure is high on species B as well, and that is why the number of species B will go down. So, because of species A increase, the number of species B got impacted and went down, even though A and B are not even directly interacting. That is apparent competition. Some characteristics of apparent competition include that the predator is a food limited generalist. So the predator has limited food. That is why it has not already reached high numbers. And it's a generalist. It's feeding on both these prey species, right? So it's a food limited generalist. The prey here can act as a keystone species, which is that if because the prey can act as a keystone species. Why? Because if even if one of the prey species increases in number, it is impacting other species in the ecosystem. So the prey here is acting can act as a keystone species. Some prey may get extinct just because of apparent competition, and the prey trophic level is regulated by the predator and the environment. So the trophic level of the prey is being regulated by the predator and the environment. So these are some characteristics of apparent competition. Okay. Coming on to generalists and specialists, you might already be aware of these terms. They are now very commonly used in ecology. And what are generalists and what are specialists? Generalists, as the term suggests, are organisms that feed on a variety of food types, and they can thrive in very different environmental conditions. Specialists, as the term suggests, they have a very specific diet, and they can survive in only very specific environments, and therefore they have a narrow niche. So when we talk about specialists, so here are two examples. One is of a koala and one is of a panda. Why they are specialists is because they have a narrow niche. They are less adaptable because they have a narrow niche. They are more likely to get extinct because if they occupy just a narrow niche, even if for example, they occupy only a range of 5 degrees like difference of temperature. For example, they survive between 25 degrees and 30 degrees temperature. So even if there is a little bit of a decrease or an increase in temperature, even if the temperature goes to say 20 or it goes to 35, then these species can go extinct. So they are more likely to get extinct. They use a very specific set of resources, and they're easily affected by changing conditions, and they have an advantage when the conditions are stable, right? Generalists, on the other hand, are organisms like raccoons or like these rat species. They have a very broad niche. They are adaptable to many environments. They're very less likely to be extinct. They use a variety of resources. They have a high range tolerance. They have a high range of tolerance, so they can tolerate a lot of change. And they have an advantage when the conditions are variable or they can change, right? So this is all about generalists and specialists. Now coming to predation, which is another type of an interaction. In this one organism, the predator, it kills and eats the other organism, which is the prey. So the predator is getting a positive outcome and the prey is getting a negative outcome. Here you can see an example of predator prey interaction in which the bird is feeding on a caterpillar, the caterpillar is the prey and the bird is a predator. We have a classic example of a leopard and a deer. um, I think it's actually a jaguar and an impala. But yeah, so the predator is feeding on the prey. And then another example of here you can see a bird of prey feeding on a snake species. So again, these are some examples of predation. Then there is herbivory. Just like predation, it is also a plus minus interaction in which one of the species is getting benefited and the other one is getting, or the herbivore is getting benefited and the plant is getting harmed because it is being fed upon. So it is also a type of predation only, but here the prey is actually a plant and the predator is a herbivore. So herbivores feeding on plants or algae constitute herbivory. Mostly it is non-fatal. They don't really kill the entire plant, but it reduces the growth and the reproductive fitness of the plants. There are different types of herbivores. Which actually there are grazers which actually feed on. Uh, they are surface level feeders, and what they do is they like bite or they chew off very close to the substrate. So if they're eating grass, they will chew off very close to the ground, so they chew off very close to the substrate. Then there are browsers. These also uh, they are similar to grazers, but they chew off well above from the substrate. So they do not like chew off very close to the ground. They take a bite away from the ground. Then there are frugivores like this orangutan. They feed on fruits. Then there are granivores like this bird, feed on seeds. Then there are folivores like this red panda, which is feeding on leaves. And then there are xylophages like these termites species, which are feeding on bark. So these are some examples of herbivory. Then what are the plant adaptations in order to avoid herbivory? How do they avoid herbivory? Plants can either be tolerant towards it. So, tolerance are when there are traits that help sustain tissue damage with little or no fitness decrease. So, the fitness is not impacted and they can sustain that much tissue damage. Then, plants could either avoid herbivory, and there are these different traits that decrease the probability of being eaten, or they could resist herbivory. There are defensive traits that reduce the amount of damage which is caused by herbivores. And some examples of resistances, they can physically resist herbivory by developing thorns and spines, because herbivores will not approach if they are thorns and they are prickly plants. And they could have these chemicals like alkaloids, terpenes, caffeine, nicotine, these secondary metabolites, which actually ward off herbivores. And luckily, they are beneficial to humans. All these secondary metabolites are produced by plants, but they can be medicinal to humans. So, but these are actually developed in order to avoid herbivory. So here you can see, for example, grasses have tolerance. When they are even if you mow a lawn, the grasses can still grow up, right? So they can grow. This is an example of thorns, which is resistance, and these are secondary metabolites, right? Okay. Now, parasitism is another positive negative interaction in which one of the species, which is the parasite, is gets benefited and the host gets harmed. It's a symbiotic interaction. So to explain to you, a symbiotic means same place. So it's if it's a close, like the two parties are close together in proximity, and if it's a long-term interaction, then that's called a symbiotic interaction. So parasitism is symbiotic in the sense that the two parties are close together in space. Close in proximity. There are two types of parasites. There are ectoparasites, which live on the surface of the host, and there are endoparasites, which live inside the host. And they often have a complex life cycle with multiple different host species. Some examples of ectoparasites are ticks and mites, which you can find on the surface of many different organisms like cats, dogs, birds, all these different organisms. And they suck the blood out of these uh, mammals. They're ectoparasites and they're endoparasites. For example, there are many examples like shown here. You can have, like, for example, we have tapeworms in humans, we have hookworms in cats. There are these giardia species in animals, blood flukes also in humans, filarial worms. All of these are endoparasites. They enter the system, they enter the body, and then impact the host. Okay, so this is all about parasitism. Then we come to amensalism, in which one of the species is harmed and the other is unaffected. For example, penicillin and bacteria. So when secretes penicillin, the fungus is not impacted, but the this penicillin enters the bacteria and leads to the death of the bacteria, because the cell wall of the bacteria ruptures the cell membrane. And so penicillin and bacteria is an amensal interaction. Then, if, for example, if you're walking around in your garden and you step on some ants, you would not know what is happening, but the ants are getting impacted. They might also die. So that is an amensalistic interaction. We are unaffected. We don't know what happened, but the ants died. So that is amensalism. And a lot of the anthropogenic impacts that we have on habitats, for example, we are we build our houses, we put on ACs to avoid the heat, but we are unaffected. But because of this, there is a lot of climate change. There is a lot of the temperature is going up for the other organisms, and they are getting affected by that. So that is amensalism. Coming to the case study of figs and fig wasps. Okay, so this was all about the interaction section. So we talked about these different interactions that are present in the living world. You have harmonious and inharmonious interactions. In harmonious interactions, you have commensalism, you have mutualism, you have proto cooperation, and then you have these different interactions, plus minus ones, in which predation comes, in which parasitism comes, in which herbivory comes, right? these interactions, and there is amensalism, which is one of them is harmed and the other is unaffected, right? So these are different interactions. Then you come to figs and fig wasps. So let's see what is going on in this system. You might already have heard about figs, you might be aware of it. So, fig trees, for example, there are these examples. There is this cluster fig, there is peepal tree, there is banyan tree, there is this creeping fig. So, there are a lot of fig species in the on the world. Figs are actually a keystone species. Keystone species are actually species that have a much greater impact on the ecosystem than the biomass that they occupy. So compared to the amount of space, compared to the amount of biomass that they occupy in this ecosystem, their impact is much greater than that. So keystone species have a very huge impact, disproportionately high impact on the ecosystem compared to their own biomass. Okay, so a fig species is a keystone species because it fruits asynchronously. That is, when one uh, it fruits throughout the year, and when one tree is fruiting, the other ones do not, like the ones close to it and do not fruit, and they fruit when this one stops fruiting. That is when they start fruiting. So these are so they provide a lot of food resource to a lot of different species of mammals and birds, which are very heavily dependent on these fig trees for their fruit requirements. Then this is a diverse and a widespread genus. There are actually around 750 species of figs found throughout the world. And within Australasia, there are around 500 species. And in India itself, there are more than 90 species of figs within our own country. So it is a very diverse and it's a widespread genus. It has a very special inflorescence, which is called a syconium inflorescence. We'll come to it in more detail in the coming slides. So it has this special inflorescence called a syconium inflorescence. And syconium acts as a microcosm. This also we'll talk about in the later slides. And these trees have a very huge cultural impact as well, as you might already be aware. In Buddhism, Buddha is said to have achieved his enlightenment sitting under a banyan tree. People tree is also very religiously linked to Hindus. They have a lot of their rituals around a people tree. So that is how it has a very great cultural influence as well, these fig trees in India and in other countries as well. Okay. So moving on, as I said, let's talk about syconium, the special inflorescence of the fig trees. So this is how a syconium looks like. This is how a fig looks like. It basically has this receptacle, which is a fleshy receptacle, and it has a lot of these tiny male female flowers here, which are very tiny. And then this is actually an ostiole, which we'll talk about later. It's like a hole here, which provides an entry point to the fig wasps. So this is an ostiole here in the syconium. Okay, syconium is a fleshy and hollow receptacle which is lined by tiny male and female flowers. As I already said, all of these here you can see tiny, tiny things. These are actually male and female flowers. There are two different types of flowers, as I said, males which have anthers, females which have the style or the stigma, and the female flowers are again of two types. There are gall flowers which have short styles, and then there are long style flowers. And there are two types of syconia. There are monoecious syconia and there are dioecious syconia. Monoecious syconia are the ones which have both male and female flowers, and dioecious syconia are the ones which have only female flowers. Okay, this is what a monoecious syconia looks like. This is the ostiole or the hole from which the fig wasps can enter. And this is an immature syconia here because you see that this is not, the receptacle is not ripe yet. And then you have these different icons. So the one in red with these two antenna type structure, this is actually the male flower with its anthers. Then this is a long styled flower which has a low lying ovary and a long style. And this long style is actually so these flowers actually get pollinated by the fig wasps. And since fig wasps do not have a long ovipositor, they're not able to um, deposit their eggs into the ovaries of these long style flowers. So these are the ones which develop into fruits. And these gall flowers actually have a short style and they have an ovary here. And these are the ones in which the fig wasps deposit their eggs, and in which develop into in which the larvae develop. And these galls, they actually become hard galls and they protect the larvae, right? So this is all about the syconium or the inflorescence of the fig trees. Now let's look at the fig and the fig wasp life cycle. What does the life cycle of fig and fig wasp look like? So first of all, what happens is there is this fig wasp, and a pollen laden female wasp, it enters the syconium. So this female wasp, which is loaded with the male pollen, it enters the syconium through the ostiole. Okay, so from here the fig wasp enters, and what it does now is that it lays eggs in some of the flowers. As we discussed, these are the gall flowers, and it pollinates the other flowers, which are the long styled flowers. So it lays its eggs in the gall flowers, and it pollinates the long styled female flowers, and then it dies. Then what happens is, over time, over a few weeks, the fig seeds develop in the long style flowers, and the galls, they start harboring the wasp larvae, and the wasp larvae start developing in the gall flowers, right? And then this is happening here. You have here these galls marked in black dots, and the other ones are the long style flowers, which are becoming the fruits. Then what happens is that the male wasps, they emerge out of the larvae, out of the male larvae. These male wasps emerge. They are wingless. They have very short antennae, and their eyes are also rudimentary, so they do not also see very well. But what their duty is, their job is that they emerge out before the females, and then they fertilize the females, and then they dig tunnels through the syconium, from where the females can actually exit, and they die. So that is all the role of the male fig wasp is. It does not really see the light, it does not really exit the syconium itself. And then after getting fertilized, the female wasps, they go around the fig, they pick up pollen from the male flowers, and these pollen laden females, they now exit the syconium to find another syconium to lay their eggs in. So this is how the cycle of the fig and fig wasps goes round and round, and it keeps repeating, right? So this is all about the fig wasp cycle. From this, it could be clear to you that both the fig and the fig wasps, they're in a mutualism, and they are very important to each other. It is such a close knit relationship that even different fig species have their own fig wasp species, which are specialist on those fig species, and so both of these are very closely tied together. So that fig cannot be pollinated by wasps belonging to different fig wasp species, and those fig wasps cannot actually go and lay their eggs in a different fig species. So they are linked together. Okay, so it's a very close knit mutualism system in which both the parties require each other, and they're both benefiting from each other. Now, one question to ask here is, how do these fig wasps find these figs? So these fig wasps, actually, to find the syconia, what happens is the syconia release a chemical cocktail. So these release these volatile chemicals or these scents, which there's a cocktail of these different scents, which actually these scents then attract the female fig wasps, and that is how they reach the syconia. Okay, so that was all about the life cycle. Moving on to the different reproductive strategies of figs. So figs have two different reproductive strategies. Either the syconia could be monoecious, as I already explained. The monoecious one will have both male flowers and the female flowers, and the female flowers will be again of two types. One is the long styled, and one is the short styled, or the gall flowers. Or, and in such a monoecious syconium, there will be both. There will be development of the seeds as well as development of the larvae, the fig wasp larvae, right? Then there are these dioecious syconia. In one type of dioecious syconia, which are called hermaphrodites, what will happen is they have some male flowers close to the ostiole, close to the entrance, and other than that, they have these long styled flowers, long styled female flowers. So if a fig wasp enters a hermaphrodite uh, okay, so they have these male flowers close to the ostiole, and they have these female flowers. And if a fig wasp enters this hermaphrodite, then what happens is all of these flowers develop into the wasp eggs, and none of them actually get what do you call it? None of them actually become develop into a seed. And the other type is actually uh, a female only, uh, the other type of dioecious ciconia is a female only ciconia in which all the flowers are actually female flowers. And if the fig wasp enters this, then it is not able, all of these are long styled, and so the fig wasps are not able to lay their eggs, and then they end up pollinating all of these female flowers, and all of them develop into a seed. Okay, so you might be so now you might have gotten an idea that it is beneficial to the fig wasp only if it enters either the monoecious ciconia, or if it enters the dioecious hermaphrodite ciconia, in which it has some males and the gallflowers, right? Because then it makes all of these um, wasp eggs they can develop. But if it ends up entering into a female only dioecious ciconia, then only the seeds will develop and none of the eggs will develop. So why does the fig wasp end up into a dioecious female only ciconia? Now, that is because the figs actually fool the wasps. As I said, the fig wasps are actually attracted to the figs when, because of the cocktail, because of the scent that the ciconia release. What happens here is this dioecious female only ciconia also releases the same type of a scent, the same type of a chemical cocktail as is released by the hermaphroditic dioecious ciconia. So because the scent is same, the fig wasps get confused and they end up entering into this female only ciconia where they cannot lay their eggs and they only end up pollinating the entire ciconia. Okay. Okay. Moving on to figs and how they act as a keystone species. As I said, figs act as a keystone species. You can see here there is such a huge variety of frugivores that feed on figs. There are bats, there are these different types of primate species, there are a lot of these bird species, especially hornbills, which feed on these fig fruits. And there are 990 bird species and 284 mammal species worldwide, which depend on figs for their fruits. And not just they heavily depend on figs for their fruits and their uh, for their fruits, basically for their nutritional requirements. A lot of their nutrition, and even hornbills are known to actually sync their breeding season with the fruiting of these fig trees, so that they have a lot of their nutritional requirements very easily fulfilled by feeding on these fig fruits, right? So that is how figs play a very keystone role for all of these different frugivores. And the fig ciconia also acts as a microcosm. As we discussed before, I'm going to discuss it now. Figs, how does the fig ciconia act as a microcosm? So apart from the fig wasps coming and laying their eggs, there are so many different types of non pollinator wasps also that depend on the fig ciconia for their life cycles. So some of the examples include, there are these gall inducing parasitic wasps. They lay their eggs in the fig fruits, and their larvae, they consume the resources which are actually meant to raise the seeds and the pollinators. So their larvae, they might be feeding on these fleshy receptacle, or they might be feeding on other resources which are actually there so that the seeds can develop, so that the pollinator larvae can develop. But these resources are taken up by these gall inducing parasitic wasps larvae. Okay, so there are these types of wasps. Then there are these parasitoids. These parasitoids, they lay their larvae very close, they lay their eggs very close to the pollinator fig wasp larvae. And the parasitoid wasps, their larvae actually grow by consuming the larvae of the uh, pollinator wasp. Okay, so in this image you can see there is this parasitoid wasp which is actually, so none of these other species they enter the fig by the ostiole. Why is that? Because in a syconium, once the fig wasp has entered the ostiole actually gets plugged up. And so none of these other non-pollinating invertebrate species enter the fig or the syconium, but they have these long ovipositors, as you can see in this image, in this representation also. And they use these long ovipositors to puncture the wall of the syconium, and then lay their eggs inside. So there are these gall-inducing parasitic wasps whose larvae actually consume the resources. There are these parasitoid wasps whose larvae feed on the larvae of the pollinator wasps. And there are small worms called nematodes, and these nematodes actually hitch rides onto these parasitoids to go from one syconium to other. So these nematodes, they actually move from one syconium to other by hitchhiking onto these parasitoid wasps. So this is how the fig itself is acting as a microcosm. There are so many different species that are dependent on the fig syconium. Moving on to our last topic for today, which is figs and seed dispersal. So, how is seed dispersal happening for these figs? As we discussed, so many frugivores are actually dependent on on figs, so they are actually dispersing the seeds of these different fig species. But how successful are they as seed dispersers? That is what a study was actually looking at. So, but first, let's look into this hypothesis called the Jansen-Connell hypothesis. So, according to the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, on the x-axis, you have distance from a parent tree. On the y-axis, you have the probability. So, when you look at these different curves, in red, you have the curve for seed distribution. Okay. So, the probability of a seed being present is much higher close to the parent tree. So the probability of a seed falling down close to the parent tree is much higher. And going further, the probability keeps reducing that a seed will be found further. So this is also called the seed shadow area, in which the seeds of the plant or the parent tree are found. So the seeds are found with much higher probability close to the parent tree itself. And as you move further from the parent tree, the probability of finding seeds also goes down. So this is how the seeds distribution curve looks like. Then there is this seed and seedling survival. So if you're looking at how the survival curve looks like, the probability of a seed or a seedling surviving actually is zero close to the parent tree. But as you move further away from the parent tree, the probability of the seedling survival goes high, and then it reaches an asymptotic level in which, even if you go further, the probability of the seedling survival stays the same. Then there is this small zone called the recruitment zone. This is the zone where the probability of the seed survival and the probability of seed distribution both are optimum. So in this zone, you see that the seeds will definitely get recruited, or the probability of them getting recruited is much high. So at this distance from the parent tree, you have a sufficient amount of seeds. So if you are at a lower distance than this from the tree, if you are at a lower distance than this, then even though the seeds are present, their survival is much less. And if you are at a distance higher than this recruitment curve, then even though the seeds can survive, they're not there. They're not present in greater numbers there. So this zone in the middle, which is called the recruitment zone, it has a good amount of seeds, and it has a good chance of that seed to survive. So that is why that area is called the recruitment zone. And this was the Jansen-Connell hypothesis. Natural enemies prevent the recruitment of offspring close to the parents, near to the parents, thereby facilitating coexistence of many species. Now, in this zone, in this distance from the parent, where the offspring seed cannot sprout and the seedling cannot survive, then in that zone, if this is the parent tree and this is the zone in which the seedling survival is almost zero, that is the zone where actually other species of trees can come up. So that is how this facilitates coexistence among species, because the offspring cannot sprout there, but other plant species can. Okay. So when you look at, we're talking about fig and seed dispersal. So there's this study by Sengupta et al., in which they were actually looking at the seed dispersal by rhesus macaques in northern India. So they were looking at northern India rhesus macaques and how they're dispersing seeds in the for the fig species, right? So the researchers, what their questions were, that they wanted to know how many plant species are being dispersed by the macaques. So how many plant species is the macaque feeding on? How are they handling the seeds? How far from the parent tree do they deposit their seeds? And what is the effect of seed handling on the germination of the seeds, right? But for our topic, we're only going to look at fig trees and the fig seeds and how they were impacted by the rhesus macaques. So their different methods were that they used to locate macaque troops, and they used to do a scan sample of the troop and collect behavioral data. They also collect fecal samples in order to collect seeds, and then they did some seed germination experiments and assays. What their findings were from this study is that the monkeys, they ate fruit from three fig species and they swallowed the seeds. So they didn't just spit out the seeds, they actually swallowed the seeds from these three different fig species. On an average, the monkeys, they dispersed the seeds more than 70 meters away from the fig trees. So there was a good amount of distance away from the parent tree. So they dispersed the seeds more than 70 meters away. And the dispersed fig seeds, they germinated much faster, and more seeds germinated as compared to control seeds. So when they did a seed germination assay or the seed germination experiment, what they did was they took seeds directly from the fig tree, and then they took seeds out of the fecal samples of the monkeys, and then they saw that the seeds that had actually traveled through the monkey gut, they germinated much faster as compared to the seeds that were directly taken from the fig tree. So that means that the seeds that traveled through the monkey gut, they were impacted by this travel in such a way that they could germinate or sprout much faster. And that is because when the seed traveled through the gut, it might have been affected by, might have undergone some aberration. The endocarp or the outer covering of the seed, it might have gotten aberrated or affected, and it might have been acted upon by the enzymes found in the monkey's gut, which makes it a little more fragile. And when this endocarp is a little more fragile, then it's able to sprout easily because it becomes porous to water and nutrients. So a lot of these water and nutrients can enter into the seed, and then it can actually sprout faster than the other than seeds that are directly taken from the fig tree itself. Okay, so this was all about figs and their dispersal. Now we come to our question and answer session for today. So I have 15 questions lined up for you, which are multiple choice questions. So I'll read them out to you and give you 10 seconds to figure out the answer, and then I'll reveal the answer to those questions. Okay, so the first question is, what type of an interaction occurs in which both species are benefiting? Is it a competition? Is it a mutualism? Is it a predation or a parasitism? You have four options: competition, mutualism, predation, or parasitism. So, what interaction occurs when both species benefit? Yeah. So, the correct answer to this question is mutualism. As we've already discussed, in mutualism, both the species benefit. Which interaction harms one species while benefiting the other? So, which out of these following interaction harms one species and benefits the other? Mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, amensalism. Four options: mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, amensalism. So, which ones, in which one species is harmed and the other is benefiting? Yes, so the correct answer is parasitism, in which the parasite is getting benefits and the host is being harmed. What type of an interaction occurs when one species benefits but the other species is unaffected? Mutualism, parasitism, commensalism, amensalism. One of the species is benefited and the other is unaffected. So the correct answer to this question is commensalism, in which one of the species is benefited and the other is unaffected. Which of the following is an example of a mutualism? So you have four scenarios here. You have to find out which of these following is an example of a mutualism: a lion hunting a zebra, a bee pollinating a flower, a flea feeding on a dog, or a vulture eating dead animals. Which of these is a mutualism? Yeah. So the correct answer is a bee pollinating a flower, which is a mutualism. The bee is getting nectar and the flower is being pollinated. Barnacles attaching to a whale without harming it is an example of what? Mutualism, parasitism, commensalism, or competition. Barnacle is attaching itself to a whale and the whale is not being harmed. What is that an example of? Yeah. So the correct answer is a commensalism. The barnacles, which are attaching themselves to the whale, they actually get to travel long distances by attaching themselves to the whale. So they get a benefit out of this interaction, but the whale in itself is completely unaffected by this interaction. So that is why it is a commensalism. Next question. What type of an interaction occurs between a predator and its prey? Mutualism, parasitism, predation, or amensalism? So the answer for this question is actually given away by the question itself. And as you might have already guessed, the answer to this question is predation. When two species compete for the same limited resource, what is that called? Again, the answer is given away in the question itself, I guess. The four options are predation, mutualism, competition, and commensalism. And so the correct answer is competition. What happens in an interspecific competition? What happens in an interspecific competition? Members of the same species compete for resources. Different species compete for the same resource. Both the species benefit. One species is harmed and the other benefits. So, what happens in an interspecific competition? Yeah, so the correct answer to this question is different species compete for the same resource. The relationship between cattle egrets, which eat insects stirred up by grazing cattle, and the cattle is an example of what? Is it a mutualism? Is it a commensalism? Is it a parasitism? Or is it a competition? Cattle egrets and cattle. Yeah, so this is an example of commensalism. A fungus and an algae form a lichen. This is an example of commensalism, parasitism, mutualism, or predation. So, a lichen, as you might be aware, is formed of a fungus and an algae. So, what is that an example of? So, the correct answer is a mutualism. So, a lichen actually includes a fungus and an algae. Both of them live together in a symbiosis relationship, and they are an obligated relationship. They both benefit out of this interaction, but they both need to stay in proximity for them to be alive as an algae. So, it is a mutualism. Keystone species are those that have a dash impact on the dash. So, what are keystone species? They have either small impact on the species, large impact on the ecosystem, disproportionately large impact on the ecosystem, or dominant impact on the ecology. Yeah, so the correct answer to this is disproportionately large impact on the ecosystem. In the fig wasp mutualism, figs are benefited by the wasps. Wasps benefit from completing their life cycle. Figs are negatively affected while wasps are positively affected, or both figs and wasps are benefited by the completing their reproductive cycles. So, what is the correct answer? Yeah, so the correct answer is that both figs and the fig wasps are benefited in completing their reproductive cycles. Question number 13. Dioecious plants have both male and female parts in the same plant, do not cross pollinate, have male and female separate, or they always self fertilize. So, what is correct for a dioecious plant? Yeah, so the correct answer is that the dioecious plants have males and females as separate plants, as we've already discussed. The inflorescence of fig is known as a racemose corymb, a syconium, an umbel, or a spikelet. What is the fluorescence of figs known as? Yeah, so now we've discussed in great detail. The fluorescence of a fig is known as a syconium. Last question for the day. The Jansen-Connell hypothesis suggests that. So, what does the Jansen-Connell hypothesis suggest? There are four options. Probability of seed dispersal decreases when the distance from the plant increases. Probability of seed germination increases with the distance from the parent tree. There is an optimal distance of the highest germination from a parent plant, or all of the above statements are relatively correct. So, what does the Jansen-Connell hypothesis suggest? Yeah. So the correct answer to this question is all of the above statements are relatively correct, as we've discussed the Jansen-Connell hypothesis. So we know that all of these are correct. The probability of seed dispersal decreases, the probability of seed germination increases with the distance from the parent tree, and there is an optimal distance with the highest germination probability from a parent plant. So, thank you for attending this class. Thank you for watching this lecture. And this was all about today. If you have any doubts, you can type them out in the chat box, or you can reach out to me via DM, or you can ask them um, in the NPTEL course section in the discussion forums, and you might get an answer there as well. Thank you for watching.